So notice again, again, thinking forward in the context of an exam, notice how I'm taking the time, taking the trouble to label everything, to make sure that everything, I'm tracing things out and showing where the equilibria are. That kind of stuff is very important. Using a little arrow to show the direction of the shift helps people understand what you're trying to talk about. So I'm going to instruct my graders to be looking for little details like that so that you guys make sure that you do that, get into good habits. When people ask me about the problem sets, should I just write down the answers, I always say to them, get in the habit of writing out how you get to what you get, explaining things out fairly completely, because that's going to help you the most on an exam. So in looking at that, a couple of things come back to the fore that I want to mention. Number one, getting back to this idea, which goes back to a question somebody asked early on Monday, the vertical axis, we put price on there. And I mentioned that we just put anything that you can measure in money terms on. And somebody said, well, we know that there's this supply curve, this purple supply curve there. And we said it's somehow related to the marginal cost curve. But aren't they two different things? Isn't there some kind of a supply price curve, and isn't there something like a marginal cost curve? And the answer is no. The supply curve is the marginal cost curve, right? Above minimum average variable cost. The idea, and I try to think about why are people asking this question. I'm thinking it's because in reality, you and I think about firms making up their minds about how much to charge, right? Firms will say, oh, how much should I charge for this good or service? In our model, the way that we built it up, remember, firms are price takers. They don't act as if, or we're pretending that they don't act so much as if they are setting the price. They're taking the price. They say to you, you tell me the price, and I will tell you how much I want to produce. And so that supply curve, that price, is just a relationship that is their solution. You tell me what the price is, and I'll tell you how much I'm going to produce. So the marginal cost curve is the supply curve. There's no distinction there, and it's derived because we're thinking about firms as price takers. Now, in reality, we know that many firms set their prices, at least to a certain extent. So what we're doing is we're going to start here with a situation, pretend that they're price takers. In other classes, you'll learn about how it works when firms are price makers. And it actually turns out that reality is an interesting mix of the two. That not only are firms acting both as price takers and price makers, but actually the extent to which that they act in either way changes as other economic circumstances change. That is to say, a firm that at some times will be acting as if it can call the shots in terms of the price it wants to charge. In other circumstances, when economic times change, we'll find that it can't do that anymore. So it is still useful for us to think about price-taking behavior because you ask the managers of a firm at any time, and you may get very different answers about how they're looking at prices and whether they think they have any input on market price here. Okay, so that's a long-winded way of saying that there really is for us no distinction between price and cost, at least on the supply side. I base my quantity decision off of the market price, and that relationship there is that profit maximizing relationship where I set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue, and so that is a marginal cost curve. There's no distinction. Second thing that I want to mention gets back to this distinction between a change in supply, change in quantity supplied, change in demand, change in quantity demanded. The way that we've represented this exercise, this effect, is first a change in demand, right? Demand fell. The marginal benefit of reading a paperback book fell. Okay. And we represented that by a shift in the demand curve, right? Because it wasn't something about the price of paperbacks that drove this behavior. It was actually a change in how much people like paperbacks, so to speak. A new substitute emerges and people reevaluate how much they like paperbacks or how much it's worth to them. That was causing the shift down because I'm not representing the preferences directly on the graph. When we think about how we get from this first equilibrium, if you want to call it equilibrium A, to this other equilibrium point, equilibrium B, that second dot there, we can see that we get there on the demand side by the demand curves actually shifting. How do we get there on the supply side, right? Because supply and demand have to be equal in equilibrium. Well, here's where we get the change in quantity supplied. We can really literally think of as the market price falls towards P2, suppliers go, oh, the market price is falling. Therefore, I'm going to re-optimize, go back to my marginal cost curve and say, oh, at that new price, I only want to produce this much at Q2. Okay? So it's the demand movement that is really driving the prices down, and we think of the suppliers as reacting to that. They're reacting to the price, okay? The change in price, which makes it a change in quantity supplied. Right? That's important because some people get really confused and they go, oh, well, the suppliers are looking at the demanders and they're saying, well, people don't want any more, so I'm not going to produce as much. Some people want to inject this kind of strategic interaction between suppliers and demanders, right? Let's not go there. That's really hard stuff. It's very advanced stuff. It certainly happens in the real world, but what we're saying is that these guys are only going to react to something that's in that supply function, right? What's in the supply function? Well, it's the price of the good, price of related goods they produce, number of firms, technology, cost of inputs. Which one of those things really change? Well, it's the price. Okay. So you can have an adjustment to equilibrium where on one side you get a change in demand, here you get a change in quantity supplied to make that happen. Right? That's really important because none of the things that drove the demand curve down when you change the people's preferences, suppliers don't care about that. Suppliers don't know what people's preferences are. They don't care about people's preferences, at least not directly. But what they do care about is they care about the price of the good, right? So it takes the change in demand to put downward pressure on the price, and then the suppliers go, oh, the market price is changing, so I need to change my behavior, right? That's really what's happening. So again, really important to be careful about the mechanics of how everything fits together. The folks, economists are always looking at this distinction, and certainly the graders, when they look at your answers, if you go, oh, well, there's a change in demand and then a change in supply, they're just going to ding you because that's not thinking about it right. Or at least it's not using the right terminology, which leads us to believe you're not thinking about it quite right. Right? So you want to be very careful about that distinction and how that adjustment to equilibrium happens. Anyway, okay, so the second thing, the other thing, the reason why I scrolled down here is to get to this other issue, which is about the change or the adjustment from one equilibrium to another. How do we get there? That's a legitimate question here in the model as we've been developing it, because we're assuming that everybody's a price taker. How do we adjust price in the market? And the answer is, in other words, we don't have a good answer for that, at least in the context that we've been talking about it. So what we have to do is we have to fudge a little bit. Gets back to my earlier comment that in reality, firms are kind of sitting on the fence between price takers and price makers. So that if it makes you, if you want to think about how we get from here to there, that we can think about telling stories like, at that old price, at that old equilibrium A, suddenly the Kindles are introduced, and the producers of paperbacks are sitting there saying, how come people aren't buying as many paperbacks anymore? And they say, well, maybe I should be making quite as many. And they go, okay, well, if I don't make as many next time, then I can make them a little bit cheaper at the margin, so I might be able to cut my price just a little bit. And they see what happens, right? So they do things like that, or they say, they may even run into a customer. They go, we just don't have as a need anymore with this substitute, and so we're not as interested. And so there's a little bit of monkeying around at the margin, and if people, again, thinking about, as I mentioned before, we use this kind of perturbation thinking. Well, if I'm making too many at this old price, maybe I'll change a little bit, drop the production down a little bit, maybe drop the price a little bit and see what happens. Okay. So we use that kind of an adjustment. Now that story depends on people actually having a little bit of input over their prices. So we have to get around it kind of in that way. And indeed, when economists really think carefully about this model, we kind of take our hands off and say, look, all we're trying to say is where the equilibria should be. We're not exactly sure how we get there. I mean, if we trace out a path, I mean, we're making it look like the path kind of goes straight down the old supply curve, but maybe it kind of wiggles a lot. Maybe if you look at the path of price through time, maybe it goes up and down. Maybe maybe we overshoot. We go too far past the new equilibrium and then have to come back. I don't know. In some markets it might happen. So what we can say for sure is that we think that, starting from that old equilibrium, no matter how we got there, that the one we're going to end up at is the new one at B. And if you want to tell little stories about people wiggling around with the price at the margin, that's fine. And indeed, again, it's fairly realistic. Certainly firms are always out there asking, what are the latest weekly, monthly sales? What do we got to do to improve the picture? If we're not making enough money, start asking questions about going on. Let's start making some adjustments, right? So that's what happens. So the upshot is we need to tell a story that's a little bit different from the one that we've been talking about in terms of strict price taking. If we're willing to do that, then it's easy to think about how that process of adjustment would happen. So if we depart a wee bit from strict price taking, then we can tell pretty accurate stories. The most interesting stories actually are ones that involve learning. So when we write down this diagram here, we're pretending we know a whole lot of stuff. We know people's preferences. We know exactly what the firm's marginal costs are. And in reality, we really don't know that much. In fact, you and I may not really be that aware of our complete set of preferences. Firms are definitely not completely aware of what all their costs are. So what we do in many cases is we learn. And how do you actually learn about the circumstance? Well, again, the learning process itself is the same kind of perturbation. I'm going to change things and see what happens. I learned, right? A colleague that I knew a while back wrote a really nice paper about that. He says, well, if we go into the real world, firms don't exactly know what demand they're facing. So what they're going to do is they're going to voluntarily change the price up and down a little bit and see what happens. And from that, they're going to estimate what the demand curve looks like. So if that helps, you can also think about firms trying to learn about their demand and costs when circumstances change. Oh, okay. Yeah. And the idea is they learn by varying P and Q a little. So in other words, the upshot of this is don't freak out too much about telling the exact honest-to-goodness story about how that adjustment takes place. What I'm looking for is to think about what was causing the equilibrium to change. Change in demand, change in supply, maybe change in both. In reaction to that, was there a change in quantity demanded, change in quantity supplied? Again, it would be nice if we could tell these exact stories. Number one, they start to get really complicated really fast. If we think about strategic interaction between different firms even producing the same stuff, and then between firms and consumers too, the stories get really interesting, but they get really complex, and you need a whole lot of machinery to tell those stories accurately. So we're kind of, again, crawling before we walk.